Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. At UFC Las Vegas, Merab Dvalishvili defeated Petr Yan in the main event to arguably become the #1 contender in the bantamweight division. Well, there is a massive problem with that. The champion at bantamweight is Aljamain Sterling, his friend and training partner. And so a lot of people are saying, what's going to happen next with Merab? Because Aljamain Sterling is the champion. And Merab even said in his post-fight interview at UFC Las Vegas that he would not fight for the belt against Aljamain Sterling. So some people are speculating on a potential Sean O'Malley fight. Some people are saying Merab needs to be cut from the organization. Some people are saying he needs to be forced to fight Aljamain Sterling. Dana White made some comments at a post-fight presser, I think, for Power Slap. We're going to talk about all that in this video. I'm going to give my opinion on what I think may happen with Merab next. And I'm also going to discuss whether or not I think he ultimately ends up fighting Aljamain Sterling. So first off, last night at UFC Las Vegas, Merab put on the performance of a lifetime. And he went out there and surprised a lot of people. I know there was some people picking Merab, but I feel like the vast majority was going with Petr Yan. And Merab's pace. We knew how good Merab's pace was, but he only had been in 3-rounders up until that point, and everyone knew he had good cardio. The pace that he was able to put on Petr Yan, and the fact that Yan wasn't able to adjust, and he was just constantly being crowded, and Merab was just constantly shooting on single legs. And, you know, it was arguably a 50-45 victory. I think there was one of those first 2 rounds could be debated. You could say it's Jan's because he landed a little bit better, shots and the takedowns weren't successful on Merab's end. But I have no problem with saying this wasn't a super competitive matchup just because Merab was just shooting takedown after takedown after takedown. I think the stats say, and again, I don't ever really use the stats, but the stats are saying that Merab shot in on 49 takedowns, almost 50 takedowns. That is insanity. And ultimately, that froze Petr Yan in front of him. He wasn't able to do anything, and Merab was able to land some shots on the feet, land some hard leg kicks, and Yan was not able to get off any offensive striking, which obviously lost him the fight. And now Merab has a big win over Yan, a fairly non-competitive win over Yan, and people are saying Merab is the #1 contender. But the champion is Aljamain Sterling, who is his training partner. So what could happen in this division? Could we see a Colby Covington, Jorge Masvidal situation? I don't know about all that. We'll get to that in a second. But I do believe Merab should be the #1 contender because a win over Yan, while Yan, I believe, was ranked #2 in the UFC official rankings at the time of the fight, and I believe O'Malley was sitting at #1, Sean O'Malley obviously is popular and just had a win over Petr Yan on paper at UFC 280. So it's really up for debate. Well, who's the #1 contender? Is it going to be Sean O'Malley or is it going to be Merab Dvalishvili? And right now at UFC 288, which I believe is May 6th, you have Aljamain Sterling defending his title against Henry Cejudo, who's the former bantamweight champion who never lost the belt. He retired as a negotiating tactic, sat out for 3 years. Now he is finally returning to fight Aljamain Sterling in May. So depending on how that fight plays out, that really is going to answer a lot of questions for what happens in the division because you have that fight. You also have Marlon Chito Vera versus Corey Sandhagen coming up. So you have 2 massive bantamweight fights coming up before you really can start to determine what's going to go on with Sean O'Malley and Merab Dvalishvili, because if Aljamain Sterling loses to Henry Cejudo, I know a lot of people are going to say, oh, well, it's answered. We know what's going to happen. Now Merab can fight for the belt. I think if Henry Cejudo wins, it gets more complicated for the Merab Dvalishvili and the Aljamain Sterling friendship and training relationship. Because if Henry wins, guess what? Aljamain Sterling's going to want a rematch. Well, guess who's #1 contender? It would be Merab. And you also have Sean O'Malley out there, but I don't know if the UFC is going to match him up with him. You look at the current rankings right now, they're going to update soon enough, but my guess is Merab is going to be sitting at #2. Probably Jan's going to be sitting at #3 unless they bump him below Marlon Vera. And Sean O'Malley's going to stay at #1, I believe. But there is a chance Merab could take that #1 contender spot. Because you look at both their fights. You look at Sean O'Malley versus Petr Yan at UFC 280. You look at Merab Dvalishvili versus Petr Yan at UFC Las Vegas. Who had the better performance? Ultimately, you can say which was the more exciting performance, which was Sean O'Malley, Petr Yan. But what was the better performance? It was Merab's performance. It was basically a shutout versus Petr Yan. Completely shut down his offense, the pace he put on him. So it's really a weird situation. But I believe if Henry Cejudo wins at UFC 288, unless it's by utter domination, that's when the situation's really going to get weird. Because you're going to have Aljamain Sterling wanting a rematch. You're going to have Sean O'Malley saying, I deserve a title fight. And then you're going to have Merab out there saying, I want to fight for the belt as well. So you're essentially going to have 3 number 1 contenders. And the UFC is going to have to decide who's going to fight for the belt. And that's where it could get weird for Merab and Aljamain Sterling, because they both would be, depending on how that fight went, they would both be deserving of a shot. But there could be a scenario where Aljamain Sterling loses and then decides, you know what, he's talked about it before, he may go up to 145 pounds. I don't think he's going to have a whole lot of success at 145 pounds, but there is a chance if he loses, he says, you know what, Merab or Sean O'Malley can get the title shot and I'm going to move up. But I don't think he's going to do that if he loses, because if he loses, what's he moving up to? Is he going to fight for a contender fight in the featherweight division? I don't think that makes a whole lot of sense. But I do believe if Aljamain Sterling wins, I think there is a chance he relinquishes the belt, he vacates the belt, and he says, I want to go up and fight for the featherweight title. Because by the time he fights Henry Cejudo, I'm assuming we will have Alexander Volkanovski versus Yair Rodriguez scheduled for some time in the summer, maybe International Fight Week. And then Aljamain Sterling can just wait it out for the winner there. And I think the UFC might give him a title shot. I don't know for sure, because Aljamain Sterling, I don't think he's super popular with the UFC, and he's not a real popular fighter in general. But if he does win, he may say, you know what, I want to give my teammate a shot at the title. We don't want to fight each other, so I'm going to move up to a separate weight class. Then you have this situation, what happens if Sterling beats Cejudo but doesn't go up? That's where it's going to get really tricky, because what are you going to do then? Are you going to give Sean O'Malley the title shot? I guess they would give Sean O'Malley the title shot. But then at that point, you have the winner of Marlon Chito Vera versus Corey Sandhagen, which, you know, is going to play out in the next few weeks. At the end of March, that fight will happen. And they're going to be kind of deserving, depending on who wins. I mean, Sandhagen's already lost to Sterling, so that would kind of put him, you know, towards the back end of most deserving, just because he's already been stopped by Sterling. But the bantamweight division is going to be super interesting. But if Aljamain Sterling does decide to stay, I think there is a possibility a year from now or so. I think what would happen is if Sterling decides to stay, let's say he beats Henry Cejudo and stays, and I'm going to give my opinion on what I think happens. I'm going to give all my predictions, early predictions, and give my best guess on what I think is going to happen in the future. But I think if Aljo wins and stays, I think what the UFC will do, they will give Sean O'Malley a title shot next. Merab has already said he doesn't want to fight for a title. So you will see Aljamain Sterling versus Sean O'Malley the end of 2023. And I think if I'm Aljamain Sterling, he's probably looking at O'Malley and thinking, okay, well, look what Petr Yan did to him in the grappling realm at UFC 280. That's a big fight for me. Sean O'Malley's a fan favorite. I can build my star power a little bit bigger. I can get an easy win. That's what he's thinking in his mind. That's not necessarily what I'm saying. And then maybe I'll go up. So that's what I think the path would be for Aljamain Sterling. If he defeats Henry Cejudo, he'll take one more fight against Sean O'Malley, attempt to defend his belt there. If he defends his belt there, then he will move up to featherweight and say it's time for Merab to become champion at bantamweight. But ultimately, it's all up in the air because you have so many big fights coming up. In a realistic world where Aljamain Sterling and Merab weren't friends, the UFC should do Aljo versus Henry Cejudo, which is already booked at UFC 288. Then the number one contender fight should be Sean O'Malley versus Merab Dvalishvili. But at this point, where you have Merab saying, I'm not fighting Aljamain, there's no way they make that fight. I don't think they make that fight anyway, because stylistically, you look at these two fighters, Merab would maul Sean O'Malley badly. And so I don't think the UFC wants to kill off a future star in Sean O'Malley, even if Merab was going to fight for the title. But the fact that Merab is not going to fight for the title against Aljamain Sterling, I don't think they make that fight anyway. Just because of that, that gives them even more of a reason not to make it. So I think what will probably happen, if I had to guess what's going to be the future of the division, what's going to be the future of Merab, I think the UFC will do and should do Merab Dvalishvili versus Umar Nurmagomedov. Umar Nurmagomedov is a hyped up prospect in the bantamweight division, but he hasn't really got that steep test in the division yet. And he keeps calling out top guys. No one wants to accept the fight with him. He said he wanted to fight in March. It looks like that's not going to happen. Well, Merab is in a unique situation where he's not fighting up because he's not fighting for the title. He's admitted, I'm not fighting for the title. So, well, then why do you have a reason to turn anyone else down? So I think the UFC could do Umar Nurmagomedov against Merab, and that'd be very interesting because you would get that test for Umar, and it wouldn't necessarily kill off another contender because at that point, at some point, Aljamain Sterling is going to drop that belt, whether he vacates it, whether he loses, because we're talking about over the next year, year and a half. At some point, I believe Sterling will drop that belt one way or another. And the bantamweight division is so stacked with contenders. Even if Merab defeats Umar Nurmagomedov, it's not a horrible situation in the bantamweight division. The bantamweight division is stacked. So I think that's what the UFC will do. I think they'll do Aljamain Sterling versus Henry Cejudo. The winner of that fight will defend against Sean O'Malley. Unless we have a controversial decision or a weird ending, then obviously you'll have the Aljamain Sterling Henry Cejudo rematch if something weird happens. But the winner of that fight will fight Sean O'Malley. And then Aljamain Sterling will kind of be, if he loses, he's going to be hanging out in the wings, maybe looking for a rematch. That's where it could get weird with Merab. And then the winner of Aljamain Sterling or Henry Cejudo or versus Sean O'Malley will then inevitably fight Merab if he continues to win. If he gets a fight against Umar, there's no guarantee he wins that fight. Umar Nurmagomedov has great grappling, but also he is a very good striker. He has excellent kicks as well, and he has shown very good cardio. So that's no guarantee win for Merab. But the bantamweight division, I know a lot of people are saying it's ruined. And they're saying Merab's ruining the division and Merab won't fight for the belt. I don't really think that's the case. Honestly, I think somewhere along the line, Aljamain Sterling is going to drop that belt. And if, push comes to shove, if Aljo goes out there and beats Henry Cejudo and then defends against Sean O'Malley and then decides he's going to stick around and still defend in the bantamweight division. Meanwhile, let's say Merab knocks off, Umar Nurmagomedov and maybe a rematch with Ricky Simone. I think the UFC will try to push for that fight. And I think if the money is correct, you could see an Aljamain Sterling versus Merab Dvalishvili fight. And stylistically, I know people constantly call Aljamain Sterling kind of boring and Merab particularly boring. I think that's a super compelling matchup. And you have Merab with this unrelenting pace. And he even said in his post-fight interview at UFC Las Vegas, we know who the real champion is. And I think, and I know teammates hype each other up, but Sterling has said things in the past about Merab, how good Merab is. And early prediction for me, I think Merab would get it done against Aljamain Sterling. So there's only so long that Sterling can keep holding on to that belt and not give Merab his opportunity. Merab is going to eventually want that opportunity one way or another. But if I had to give my final official prediction, what I think will happen is Henry Cejudo will defeat Aljamain Sterling. Aljamain Sterling will disappear for a little while. Henry Cejudo will then defend against Sean O'Malley. I believe Henry Cejudo will win that fight again. And I think in the meantime, Merab will fight someone back in the rankings, potentially even a Corey Sandhagen Chito Vera winner, which I don't necessarily want to see, especially if Merab's not fighting for the belt. But I think they'll make that fight if Aljamain Sterling loses the title. And then you will see Merab versus Henry Cejudo in the future. That is my best guess for how the bantamweight division plays out. But I don't think Merab's ruining the division. The only way Merab could effectively ruin the division is if Aljamain Sterling holds on to the belt and the UFC keeps feeding potential title fight contenders to Merab. If you have Merab knocking off Sean O'Malley, and then you have Merab knock off the winner of Chito Vera, Corey Sandhagen. I think at that point, and then you have Merab, knock off another contender. Let's say Yanez beats Rob Font. That's the only way you could effectively ruin the division. And if Merab's not willing to fight Aljamain and Aljamain is still the champion for the next year or so, I think the UFC will either kind of put Merab on the shelf or just give him up-and-coming guys who look like absolute killers in hopes that they dethrone Merab as kind of like a number one contender gatekeeper. I think that's what the UFC will do. They will play this situation smart. But if Aljamain Sterling, mark my words, I believe if Aljamain Sterling holds on to the belt for the next 2 years, and doesn't go up to 145 pounds, I think Merab will fight Aljamain Sterling. And what an amazing storyline that would be. I already said it would be a great stylistic clash. What a storyline that would be. That would be like John Jones versus Rashad Evans back in the day. It would get very interesting very fast, and it's already a great stylistic clash between the two. But the division is just crazy. You have lots of talent. So regardless, I think we're going to get a bunch of good fights in the division. But if I had to guess, we are getting Merab Dvalishvili versus Umar Nurmagomedov next. You're going to have Henry Cejudo defeat Aljamain Sterling, and then Henry Cejudo versus Sean O'Malley the end of the year. And then maybe Merab fights the winner of that fight in early 2024. That is my best guess. But I do not believe Merab is ruining the division. And even though he doesn't have the most aesthetically pleasing style, I think he still is a fun fighter to watch because the pace he puts on guys is unbelievable. So I think he's getting a little bit of unfair criticism. You know, the Jose Aldo fight was terrible, but the Yan fight I didn't think was the most horrible fight I've ever seen. The way he was putting pace on an elite level striker and an elite level grappler in Petr Yan was very impressive. To have the cardio to go that hard attempting takedowns against Petr Yan for 5 rounds was something to behold. But the division is full of talent. The division is full of elite level fighters and amazing stylistic clashes. I can't wait to see how the 135-pound division plays out over the next year and a half. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Do you think we'll ever see Aljamain Sterling versus Merab Dvalishvili? Do you think the UFC would ever book Sean O'Malley versus Merab Dvalishvili? I think, you know, if the UFC called up Sean O'Malley and offered him the Merab fight, I think Sean O'Malley is immediately calling up Colby Covington and joining him in witness protection at the safe house. There is no way that Sean O'Malley would accept that fight. That is a nightmare matchup for him. But let me know what you guys think about that all down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.